Wesathie hale. So today I thought it would be fun to read the same poem in Latin and in Old English. The original poem was written in Latin by Boethius, who was a Roman statesman in the beginning of the 6th century. He presumably wrote it rather close to his execution, which was in 524 AD. And it's, sort of it criticizes people who are sort of obsessed with fame. It calls, it's a vain pursuit. There's no reason to be sort of obsessed with fame. And he wrote this poem. It's referred to in the Latin book of Consolation of Philosophy. It's often marked as 2.7 because it's in the 7th book of the Consolation of Philosophy. It's in the 2nd book of the Consolation of Philosophy, and it's the 7th poem in that book. The Old English poem was translated from Latin meter into Old English meter at the end of the 9th century. It's attributed to King Ælfred the Great. Probably wasn't actually translated by King Ælfred the Great, more so essentially probably one of his advisors or someone shortly after Ælfred the Great who was attempting to lend credence to the poem or to the translation by attributing it to him. But it is probably around Wessex in England, late 9th century translation. We're going to start with the Latin today. I'm just going to read through it, and then I'll kind of walk through it and explain what's going on. And then we'll move over to the Old English. I'll read through it, and then I'll walk through it again, explaining what's going on. And then we'll kind of point out some differences as I'm going through the Old English, the choices that the translator made in making the translation. And yeah, it'll be fun. Okay, let's get into it. So the Latin poem begins, Quicumque solam mente praecipiti petit, summumque credit gloriam, late patentes aeteres cernat plagas, artumque terrarum situm, brevem replere non valentes ambitum pudebit aucti nominis. Quid, o superbi, colla mortali jugo frustra levare gestiunt? Licet remotos fama per populos means diffusa linguas explicet, et magna titulis fulgat claris domus, mor spernet altam gloriam. Involuit humile pariter et celsum caput, aequatque summis infima. Ubi nunc fidelis ossa fabricii manent, quid Brutus aut rigidus Cato, signat superses fama tenuis pauculis, inane nomen literis. Sed quod decora novimus vocabula num scire consumto statur? Iacetis ergo prorsus ignorabiles, nec fama notus efficit. Quid si putates longius vitam trahi, mortalis aura nominis, cum serra vobis rapiet hoc etiam dies, iam vos secunda mors manet. Okay, so what's happening here? Quicumque solam mente praecipiti petit. That is, whoever, quicumque, solam mente praecipiti petit summumque credit gloriam. So solam gloriam, whoever, only glory, mente praecipiti, sort of with a cast forward, sort of headlong mind, petit, summumque credit. So whoever seeks only glory, solam gloriam, with a headlong, head forward mind, and gives it sort of all of the credit, summumque credit gloriam. Late patentes aeteres cernat plagas artumque terrarum situm. Late, sort of obviously, out in the open, long. Patentes aeteres cernat plagas. The patentes plagas, the sort of open, widely available to see fields, aeteres of the ether, of eternity. Cernat artumque terrarum situm. Sort of divide themselves, cernat, from the short and sort of fixed of the lands, terrarum. So the sort of great, vast ether of eternity is separated from the sort of confinedness of the world, terrarum. Brevem replere non valentes ambitum pudebit aucti nominis. So brevem ambitum replere non valentes aucti nominis pudebit. Pudebit. He will be ashamed. That is, he or she will be ashamed. Aucti nominis, of their great name. So they will be ashamed of their great name. Non valentes, which is not able to replere, sort of fulfill brevem ambitum, their kind of brief ambition. So they will be ashamed of their great name when they realize that it can't fulfill their ambition. Quid, o superbi, colla mortali jugo frustra levare gestiunt. Quid, that is why, o superbi, o you proud ones, colla mortali jugo frustra levare gestiunt. So why do you gestiunt? Why do you try to levare, to lift, colla, from your neck, mortali jugo, the sort of the yoke of mortality, frustra, in vain. So why are you trying to become immortal, essentially? Why are you trying to lift the yoke of mortality from your neck in vain? Licet remotos fama per populos means diffusa linguas explicet. So licet here serving to mean like sort of, it could be, or let's imagine fama, means, the sort of spread out wandering fame, per populos remotos, through, or sort of, distant people, diffusa, sort of spreading out, linguas explicet. It sort of, it unlocks the tongues of these people. So let's say that your fame goes out and unlocks the tongues of great foreign people. Et magna titulis fulgeat claris domus. Great houses, or just a great house, magna domus, titulis claris, with sort of clear titles, or illustrious titles, fulgeat, thunders. So, people could be talking about you from all across the world in different languages. They could be giving your house great names. Your house could be thundering with illustrious names. Said, mors spernit altam gloriam. Death despises high glory. Spernit. Involuit humile pariter et celsum caput. So involuit, it sort of mixes together humile et celsum. So humile, the low, et celsum, and the high, caput, the low head and the high head, it mixes together pariter. They're the same. That is, death considers the exalted and the poor to be the same. Aequatque summis infima. So that's, again, aequat, it makes them equal. Summis, the very most high, infima, the very lowest. Ubi nunc fidelis ossa fabricii manent. Where now lie manent, ubi manent, where do the ossa fabricii fidelis, where do the bones of trusty Fabricius lie? Where are they? Quid Brutus aut rigidus Cato? Where is Brutus, or sort of what happened to Brutus? What about rigidus Cato, sort of strong Cato? What happened to them? Signat superstes fama tenuis pauculis inane nomen literis. So signat, that is, it signals. Superstes. Superstes is sort of the remnant. Superstes fama tenuis pauculis inane nomen literis. So superstes nomen signat. Their name is sort of a remnant. Or I should say fame, that is, with sort of tenuis pauculis literis, in sort of these, drawn out little forgettable letters or writings, fama inane, sort of with a sort of useless or unknown fame. That is to say, barely nothing exists of them now, except for what we can read in a few little sentences here and there. That is to say, like, they have essentially died, not just in person, but also in memory. Sed quod decora novimus vocabula, num scire consumtos datur. Said, but, we haven't totally forgotten these people. We do have things written about them, and that those things are decora vocabula, so sort of nice words, or they have been, an alternative reading maybe would be they have been decorated by words. But we know these. Novimus decora vocabula. Num scire consumtos datur. Does it follow datur? Num datur, does it follow that we know the dead? Scire consumtos? So we have things written about them. Does that mean that we know them? Jacetis ergo prorsus ignorabiles, nec fama notos efficit. So, jacetis, sort of, you will go, you will die, you will throw. I think here it means more like you will go, ergo. Prorsus ignorabiles, entirely unknown. You will become entirely unknown. Nor, nec, fama, notos efficit. Nor will fame sort of make you known to anyone. Quod si putatis longius vitam trahi, if you think that you are going to live longer, mortalis aura nominis, by a sort of fame of a mortal name, that is, if you are really expecting to live longer because of the fame of your legacy, your what you leave behind you, your name, cum serra vobis rapiet hoc etiam dies, when, after a while, this day as well takes this from you, iam vos secunda mors manet. Now you will die a second time. Literally, you will suffer a second death. So that is to say, if you are really putting all of this stock into the fact that your name will live longer than you, now, instead of just dying once, you're going to die twice. Once physically, and again when your fame dies out, when the last person forgets about you. So don't put your faith, the poet is saying, in that, because this way you only die once. If you don't care about it, you only die once. If you do care about it, you die twice. Okay, that's the Latin. Now let's move on to the Old English. Again, this is meter 10 in the meters of Boethius. And yeah, we'll read the Old English now. And then as we go through this, after reading through it once, we'll talk about how the translations differ and maybe what the translator was trying to get at here. Yif nu halethachwane hlizan lyste, unnit te yilp agan wille, thonne ichine wode wordum bidan, that he hine eichwonon utan umbethochte, swerle umsawe, sooth ast on west, hu wirgel sint, woknum imbutan, helvenes whalve. He is no trum mij, they finchan, that theos they see al for that other unimet lutel, thach heu unwisum widgrel finche, on stedes thronlich, sterlasum men, thach mij thon a wisan on witlokan, thar yitzunge julpe shomian, thonne hine thas hlisan hardos lusteth, und he thach ne mij thon a tobredan over thas narwan nania thinja erdan shatas. Is that unnet julp? Alla overmodon, hui a luste mit eurum swiran selvra willum, that sware juk, simle under lutan. Hui je that unnet alni swinken, that je thon lisan habantiliath over theodama thon eutharsi. Thach nu je sale, that sooth o the north tha utmeestan earthbuende on moni theorisch miklum herien. Tha qua adalisi gebuurtum, welum je wordad, and on ulenchum theo, dugutum deore, dath thas ne schriveth. Thon him room for lat roder waldend, ac he thon a welegan wadlum je liche even mar ne death, alches thinges. Where sint nu thas wisan welondes ban, thas goldsmiths, they was you marrost. For hui each quath thas wesan for thee each quath thas wisan welondes ban, for thee anigum ne mai earthbuendra se craft losian, they him Christ on lanth. Ne mai mon avre thi eid ane rechan his craftes beniman, the mon on chiron mai, sunan on swivan, on these ne swiftan rodor on his richterine rinka ani. Hwa wat nu thas wisan welondes ban, on wilcum hichlawa rusan thechen, where is nu se richa romana vita, on se arda, they we sprekaf, heura hertoga, se je haten was midtham burgwarum brutus nemned. Where is ax se visa, on se wurtjorna, on se fastrada focus hyrde, se was uth vita alches thinges, kene on crafty, tham was katon noma. He waren je vuren forthi witene, not nani mon where he nu sindon. What is hier her buton se lisa an? Se is ac to lutos swelcra lario, for tham tha magurinchas magurincas maran wirde waron on wurde, ac it is wirde nu, that yon thas erdan eiwar sindon heura yelikan hwan imsprake, summa openliche alle forritene, that he se an hucuden emai formare veras forthje brengan, that thach ye nu wenen on willian, that ye longe tid liban moten, wat eo avre thubet beo otha finche. For tham thene forlat, forlate, thach hit long finche, dath after dogorimme, thonne he haft drichnes lave. Wat thonne habe haletha ani, gumma at tham yilpe, yif hine ye gripan mot, se age hadath after thisum worlde. Okay, so now we have the Old English translation, which again was written about, let's say, 4 centuries after the death of Boethius. This is in Wessex, and we begin with Yif nu halathachwane, if any man, if any sort of prince, let's say, lisan liste, lists after fame, lisa. Unite yilp agan wille, he wants to have a sort of unuseful boast, unitne yilp. Thonna, ichine worde wordum bidan, then I would pray to him with words, I would ask him with words, that he hine eichwanon uton imbethochte, that he literally looks around outside. Eichwanon uton imbethochte, or sort of thinks about what's going on outside. Swotele umsawe, sort of clearly sees. Sooth, asked on west, so south, east, and west. Hu wiedgelsint walknum imbutan heavenus halve. So how sort of broad the clouds around the sort of with wiedgelsint walknum, sort of how wide is sort of in clouds then, or around the clouds, the sort of the turn of the heaven, the turn of heaven, so the halve. Hies notrum mai ade thinchan. So to the sort of wise man, hies notrum, or wise men here. This could either mean wise man in a sort of substantive adjective, or two wise men, hies notrum. Yeah, it could mean, it probably, I'm going to go here with single, because it doesn't really say. I'm going to go with single here. He is snotrum, to the wise man. Let's say it's an adjective. He is snotrum mai. To the wise man, it may easily seem, thinchan, that theos erde si alfor that other unimet lutel, that this earth, theos erde, si alfor that other, because of the other, unbelievably small, unimet lutel, sort of unmeasurably small. So, although to the unwise man, it seems to be very large. It seems very large, or seems very wise to the unwise man. It seems onstead strongly, sort of fast in its foundation. Sterlausem men, to the unlearned men. So, however, the wise man, thonawizan, on Yewitlokan, in his mind, literally in the lock of his wit, on Yewitlokan, thare yitzunge yilpas shomian. So he may sort of become embarrassed of this greed for a boast, of this greed for fame. Here we see fama, Latin fama, being translated as hlisa, fame, or yilp, which is literally a boast. So something, this is very Old English here. They're translating it into their own society, in which you would often find men in the mead hall, boasting about their accomplishments. This is being written a little after the time of the mead hall, but that kind of cultural image is still very prevalent for them. And a yilp, we see even up until the end of the 10th century, in the Battle of Malden, you see people boasting with yilp. Beot there, I think, more accurately. Thonne hinethas lisan hardos lusteth. So when he most strongly lists after fame, that is, desires fame, lusteth thas lisan. On thach ne mai thonne tobredan over thas narwan nani ethinja erdan shatas. So, but he can't spread it, tobredan, over thas narwan erdan shatas, over these sort of narrow tracts of the earth, nani ethinja, by nani ethinga, By no means can he do it. Hey ne mai. He can't. That is, he can't spread his fame over the world, even though it's so small. So he should be ashamed of that. That unnet yilp. That is a sort of a useless boast. Alla overmodan. Hui eu a lyste mit eurum swiran selvra willem that sware juk simle underlutan. So here we have the translation of the part in the Latin poem where it said, quid o superbi. You sort of proud folk, why do you always try to lift the yoke of mortality? But here it says, why do you always want to put your neck under that yoke? So I'm not sure if this is a mistranslation, if the translator didn't understand the Latin very well. Probably more likely they just kind of wanted to rephrase it. But instead of asking why man is sort of afraid of mortality, here he says, why do you want to subject yourself to fame? Hui eu a lyste, why are you always desiring with your neck, mid eurum swiran, selvra willem, by your own will, that sware yoke, that kind of sort of great yoke, always to undertake? Why do you always want it, of the yoke of fame? Hui je that unnet alne swinken. Why do you always, about that sort of useless thing, unnet, alne, why do you always, sort of work so hard, swinken, about, sort of to get it, that unnet. That ye thonachlis an habantiliath over theodamath on eotharsi, that you would kind of cultivate this fame over more nations than it would ever be sort of needful to you, thon eotharsi, than it requires. Thach nu jesale, that suth othe north thought each mestan earthbuende on moni theodish miklum herien. So here we get the translation of the part where the Latin poet says, licet. Let's imagine that you are being praised throughout the nations, throughout these far people. Here we have, thach nu jesale, even if it were to happen to you, that, south and north, the sort of farthest earthbuende, the farthest denizens of the world, in many different languages, on moni theodish, literally in many a language, on many a language. Miklum herien, they sort of greatly praise you. Thachwa adelisi jebuurdum, welum jeburdad, onon blenkum theo, dugdum deore. So let's say that some adele, some prince, be in sort of, or let's say here that someone be adele, that someone is noble, in sort of the birth of princes. So here we get, this wasn't mentioned in Latin, but high birth, also a very important concept in Old English times, is mentioned here as a sort of cultural image. This where were you born among the erlas, among the princes, the sort of important people of society. And welum juerdad, you were sort of adorned with wealth. And on wlenchum theo, in sort of great deeds, you prosper, theo. This is more commonly written theon. Theon is the infinitive, but that is, it's to prosper. Dugdum deore, you are sort of, you're dear to your tribe, to your people. Dath thasne shriveth. Death doesn't care, basically. Death does not pay any heed to any of that. So you could be praised by many languages in many different lands. You could be of high birth. You could be rich. You could be doing great deeds of valor. You could be very important to your people. Death doesn't care about any of these things, is what it's saying. Thonne him room for... Oh, okay. And then, it continues. Dath thasne shriveth. Thonne him room for lat roder or wildend. Okay, so this is an interpolation of the Old English translator. The Latin translator doesn't really mention God at all. Boethius is not what I would describe as an explicitly Christian text. It's obvious that Boethius is Christian, and God does get mentioned very often, but he's mentioned in a very sort of like distant sense. It's a very philosophical treatise. And the Old English translator has a very clear agenda, as we'll see probably more in the next couple lines, to sort of rectify that. I can imagine that the Old English translator thought that the Consolation of Philosophy was a great text, but it wasn't Christian enough. It wasn't explicitly Christian enough. I'm not even sure if Christ is mentioned in the Consolation of Philosophy. Again, Boethius was obviously a Christian, and I'm not fact checking myself on that. I don't know if Christ actually wasn't mentioned, but that's no question in the Old English translation, as we're about to see. But this Roder Waldend, this sort of wielder of the stars, that is God, when he gives the ability to death, Thonaweligan, Wadlum Ilice, the wealthy man, Thonaweligan, similarly to the poor, Wadlum, Evan Mar Neideth, even sort of just as nobly, just as respectfully, he does things, to the wealthy and to the poor alike. Altestinges, sort of in all regards. Where sind nu thas wisan Waylandus ban? Okay, great. Wayland, who is Wayland? In the Latin edition, we have Fabricius. And Fabricius was a general who fought against Pyrrhus of Epirus, and famously sort of refused to surrender. I think he was offered a lot of money and refused to surrender. This is probably around 200 BC, if I'm remembering correctly. What probably happened here is the Old English translator reads the word Fabricius, thinks, well, that means smith, has no idea who Fabricius is, and just assumes that it's some sort of great smith. And so interpolates Wayland, who is, as far as we can tell, a really famous smith from this sort of shared Germanic mythology. He appears in the Old Norse poems as Wolundr, and I think it's just in Old English and Old Norse that we have attestations of Wayland. But there's another Old English poem, Deor, and Deor begins by describing Wayland. Wayland himbe worman rakaskunode. It talks about how he was hamstringed and forced to make things for Neidhad was the name of his captor. Yeah, Neidhad. And Neidhad made Wayland, stay in this sort of prison and make things for him, and to keep him there, he hamstringed him. Anyway, all that aside, Wayland is a smith, and so the Old English poet just thinks, well, Fabricius, I'll just replace this Fabricius, who no one knows about, who was obviously a smith, because his name means smith, with Wayland. So where are the bones of Wayland? The goldsmith, who was long ago the greatest. Now he kind of explains himself here, which this is totally not found in the Latin. For each quath as wees on Wayland's ban, I said, I mentioned the bones of Wayland because angom ne mij earthbuendra se kraft losian the him Christ on land. No one of the earth buendra, of the sort of dwellers of earth, can lose the craft that Christ gave them. So I talked about Wayland specifically because I want you to think about the fact that he was a great smith, and no one can take that away from him because Christ gave him that. This is entirely the invention of the Old English translator, but he wants to, tell the audience that, this theological fact that neimon avre the aid ane rechan his craftes beniman, themon on chiran mai, and we'll pause there. No one can ever, no matter how hard they try, the aid, the easier, from a wretch. Here's probably the best translation of ane rachan. No one can beniman. No one can take his craft. No one can take away what he's good at. It would be easier for them, or it would be just as easy, theaith, themon on chiran mai sunnan on swivan, on thisne swiftan rodor of his richtrine rinka ani. So it would be great, it would be easy, just as easy for rinka ani, for any of the, any men, literally any of the men, so any man, to sort of turn the sun back on chiran, on swivan, both sort of working on the same object here, sunnan, to sort of turn back the sun, and the quick star or planet, thisne swiftan rodor of his richtrine, sort of, on swivan, I guess, on chiran, take the swift rodor, the sort of the swift sun or planet or star of his richtrine, sort of out of his path. So it would be just as easy for you to turn back the sun or move the, some sort of planet out of its path. Wat nu thas wees on Waylondesban. So now returns to the question. Who knows now where they are? On welcome he hlawa rus on Thetchen, sort of in which mound they are covering the ground. Who knows where Wayland's bones are? Where is nu se richa romanavita? Okay, now we return to the Latin. Now we're talking about se aurora, they were sprekath, heura hertoga, se haten was mit am burgwarum brutus nemned. The Old English translator probably feels a bit of pressure to explain who Brutus was, who Cato was, whereas the Latin translator can just say quid Brutus, what was the word? Quid aut rigidus Cato. What about Brutus? What about rigidus Cato? The Old English translator needs to explain who those people are. So where is the most powerful? The powerful sort of wise one of the Romans, and the swift Aroda, the one that we spoke about, they were imsprekath, heretoga, their general, who was named mitam burgwargum among the people Brutus. He was Brutus nemned. He was named Brutus. Waar Isaac se visa on se wertjorna on se fastrara focus hurde se was udwita alchestingus kene on crafty tham was katon noma. So where is also waar Isaac se visa, the wise, on se wertjorna, and the sort of the worthily eager, I guess I could say, and se fastrara, quick to counsel, focus hurde, the leader of the people, the herd of the people, shepherd, I guess I could say, of the people. He was a philosopher, se wes uthwita, alchestingus, of everything. He was a philosopher of all things. Kene on crafty, he was sort of effective, he was keen, and he was crafty, he was clever. And his name was Cato, tham was katon noma. He waren gefuren fortjuitene. They were forgotten long ago, which in Old English times might have actually been true. Not nani mon where he knew sindon. No one knows where they are now. Unclear whether or not he's talking about their bodies or their souls. What is her buton sechliza on? Here, this really ought to be amended to her. What is of them here? Literally what remains of them. Buton sechliza on, except for the fame. Se is ac to luto swelkra larewa. That is, and even the fame is not enough for such great teachers. That is, they're not praised as much as they ought to have been or ought to be. For tham magorinkas maran wirde warun worlde. Those magorinkas, those sort of warriors or men, were sort of worth more when they were in the world, or they were given more praise when they were in the world than they are now. Debatable. Ak it is wurzenu. It is worse now. It is wurzenu. That jont thas erdan aiwar sindon hera yelikan hwan im sprake. So it's worse now around the whole world, everywhere, aiwar sindon yelikan hera. So people who are like them, hwan im sprake. No one talks about them. That is to say, nowadays there are Catos and Brutuses, but no one even knows who they are. Summa openly che alle forritene. Some people have openly, completely forgotten Brutus and Cato and Wayland. That he sechliza hiukude ne mai formare veras fortie brengan. So the fame sechliza ne mai hiukude sort of like by itself, by the kind of color, by the what's the word? By its own sort of notedness, maybe. The formare veras, the sort of well-known men, it can't bring them forth anymore to the sort of the knowledge of the people. Thach ye nu wenen and willian that ye longetid liban moten. Though you now hope and want that you might live a long time, liban moten, that you may be permitted to live, longetid, a long time, what you avri fibet beu o the thinche? How would that ever be better for you or even seem better for you? For tham the nane for late, thach it long thinche, dath after the dogorime. For tham the, because nane for late, no one will dath after dogorime. So after the count of your days, after the dogorime, dath nane for late. Death will not abandon any one of you. Thachit long finche. Even though it might seem like a long time, after the dogorime, after the count of days, death will not forget any of you. Thonne he haft dricknes lave. When he has the sort of the leave of the Lord. Literally, lave is leave here, so permission. The permission, the leave, dricknes lave. What thonne habe halitha ani? What then does any man have? Does any prince? Halith literally means like a prince, like a young warrior. What thonne habe halitha ani? Guma at tamilpe. To boast. A man at the boast. What does he have to boast about? If hine ye gripan mot se eter dath after this mortal day. If se eter dath, if the eternal death is permitted, mot, hine ye gripan, to grab him, literally to have hold of him, after this mortal day, after this world. So what does anyone here have to brag about if death can seize you after this world? So, I hope you guys enjoyed this. This was, again, a Latin poem translated into Old English. And as we saw, a couple interesting things. The Old English translator had a lot more emphasis on Christianity. So Christ is actually mentioned. Drichten is mentioned. Roderwaldend is mentioned. Whereas that stuff is, less prevalent in the Latin version. And then also we get this really interesting interpolation of Wayland for Fabricius. A really funny moment where, again, the Old English translator just didn't know who Fabricius was, and just thought his name meant Smith, and so thinks, I know a Smith, Wayland, and puts him in there instead. I hope you guys enjoyed this. If you enjoy content like this about Latin or Old English, specifically though Old English, please consider maybe becoming a supporter on Patreon, or just subscribing to the channel, or just returning and watching more videos. Either of those would be great. Let me know what you think in the comments. If you would like another sort of reading, I would be all ears to hear suggestions. And yeah, until next time, Farathye Isunde.